Welcome to another off-season edition of Fantasy Football Today DFS. My name is Sia Nejad, and I'm taking over this week for Frank Stamfel, who quite frankly is neck deep in baseball. And as always, you can catch him on the Fantasy Baseball Today pod. But today, I am here with TJ Hernandez, the director of DFS for 4for4 Football. You can catch him on Twitter at TJ Hernandez. TJ, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, man, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk a little off-season DFS. This is my favorite part. I love the theory side of DFS.
And that's honestly, I feel like that's the side where you really get your wins. And I think TJ Hernandez is really the guy, one of the guys in this offseason series that we absolutely have to talk to. And if those of you that are listening, if you don't already follow TJ Hernandez again, TJ Hernandez, that's super easy. It's just his full name. Go ahead and give him a follow. He puts out a lot of really helpful content, especially in the DFS space. And we're going to touch on that a little bit. But TJ, I did want to ask you, obviously you're pretty big in the NFL DFS space, but outside of that, are you dabbling, or are you fully immersed in some of these other DFS sports?
Not until this year. I mean, my goal when I got into this was just to somehow make money watching football. So I've always been very hyper concentrated on football. But this year with Formula One launching on DraftKings, I kind of got into that. It's a new sport, and I was like, this is perfect timing. It lines up perfectly with NFL offseason. So do things like baseball and golf, but everyone's already really good at those. So I was like, let me try this new sport and see if maybe I could figure something out here.
And it's interesting because I'm in South Florida, and just the other day I was actually down. I was watching one of the tennis matches at the Miami Open, and I was walking on the track as I was going to my car, and I literally was like, well, what's this? Like, I didn't even really see what I was walking on, and it is big time down here. I mean, this is a big thing, and I'm curious, TJ, when you get into a new sport, or what some people might deem like a niche sport, I feel like there's an obvious edge right off the bat. Have you found that with your, I don't know how long you've been doing it, but at least a few months, I assume.
Yeah, I mean, we're only 4 races in. Yesterday was only the 4th race of the season. And like I said, DraftKings just launched it this year. So until 4 races ago, no one had ever played Formula One DFS. So I with any new sport, there's going to be an edge just because, one, people just aren't going to know the sport very well. I mean, for those that are new to Formula One or haven't watched Formula One, the Netflix series Drive to Survive has really got people into it. But I think the edge obviously lies in doing your homework, figuring out the sport, figuring out the scoring system. But I think just having a DFS background and being able to just apply generic showdown theory to a new game is going to give you an edge in that sport. And we're seeing already with 4 races of data, you can tell people are just putting out some really bad lineups, and there's lineup builds, lineup constructions are always kind of going to dominate how you could be good at a DFS sport, and it's going to let you pretty quickly be able to pinpoint who knows what they're doing and who doesn't. So definitely seeing an early edge in it. And the prize pools are still relatively small, which obviously if you're playing the sport, you want them to be bigger, but at the same time, you're not attracting the sharks with those big prize pools either. So I think there's probably just a lot of people that are Formula One fans that want some action, but aren't necessarily good DFS players.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned like people who are not good DFS players, bad lineups. The one thing we try to do on Fantasy Football Today DFS, and that's me and Frank and Mike McClure, is try to sort of educate people. Obviously, week to week, what we got our plays, but really last season in the preseason, we were really talking about theory, and that's really what I want to get into with you. But let me ask you, how long have you been doing this, and was there sort of a seminal moment where, TJ, you discovered, hey, I'm pretty good at this, I should probably invest more time and perhaps money into this?
Well, it was a little bit by force. I was big into poker in the online poker days, and I think you have a little bit of a poker background yourself.
I do.
So when Black Friday hit, I was left kind of scrambling, and I don't know if you're familiar with one of the old training sites, Deuces Cracked. I was pretty heavily involved with those guys, and a couple of guys from there got into DFS themselves. So I was like, let me try out this new thing. And one of the old Deuces Crack guys, he was actually working on the operator side. There was a sports betting website that was specifically horse racing, and they kind of started their own DFS product. So those horse race betting guys were basically that was feeding their entire DFS offerings. So I jumped in there and I was like, let me see what I could do in here. Long story short, basically ended up buying up all their lobbies. And obviously back then, if you even knew what a running back value was, you had an edge. So I was like, oh, I could make a couple bucks doing this. And then that obviously that now doesn't mean you're good. It just, I was in the right spot at the right time. But from the content side of things, I knew from poker, from that explosion, that if DFS was going to get big, and obviously we were hoping sports betting, but we didn't know how that was going to work, that content was going to come along with it. So I was kind of lucky enough to had seen how that had grown with poker and got out in front of that a little bit. And luckily it snowballed into some opportunities. There's no guarantee there, but luckily had a little bit of foresight there on that one.
That's great. I was actually in on the front end as well, way before DraftKings and FanDuel, with a site called Fantazzle.com.
Oh, wow.
And
Yeah.
had you heard of that?
No, that's that. But I was just like draft day and then Star Street days. Like that's when I got into it.
Yeah, and long story short on that, I was just producing content for them, and then they kind of went away because back then we really weren't sure about the legalities of daily fantasy sports. And then it just, for me, I just kind of walked away from it. I was doing my 9 to 5, and then boom, DraftKings comes down a few years later with FanDuel. And, looking back, it's like, maybe I should have done the TJ route and just kind of stuck with it. But anyway, here we are. But let's focus back to NFL DFS. The first thing I want to know is what contests you play in, because I think when I ask you your perspective when it comes to lineup construction and fading chalk and things of that nature, I think it's important to know where your baseline is. What type of games, contests are you playing?
Yeah, this is kind of evolved going back to those early draft day, Star Street days. Kind of from my poker background, cash game grinder, I kind of took that same approach to DFS. A lot of cash games, a ton of head-to-heads. That's kind of where I kind of grinded my teeth in DFS. Over the last couple of years, we've seen it's just harder. Cash games are harder. Everybody has a lineup generator or a lineup optimizer. The most casual fan can find a pretty decent one. NFL's the most popular sport. Even the worst projections are pretty good. So if you plug those into an optimizer for FanDuel and DraftKings, you're probably going to be able to be at least competitive in cash games. Now I still do play a fair amount of cash games, but I was pretty much strictly playing those. I've kind of moved on to the single entry, 3 max, higher stakes, lower field tournaments, and obviously you're playing a lot tougher competition. But for how I like to play the game and how I think about the game, mass multi-entry just isn't my thing, even though that's what I've been doing in Formula One pretty much exclusively. But from a football standpoint, you can really get into the macro of the game, really kind of like poker. It's so much about what is your opponent doing when there's only 100 lineups in the field and you can only play one lineup. It goes so far beyond who's the best value this week. So over the last, I'd say 2 or 3 years, I've really shifted my attention to higher stakes, small contest, and really focusing on DraftKings. That's another thing that's kind of evolved, is not trying to play everything. I still, throw a couple lineups out everywhere, but really trying to hone in on that specific game.
Yeah, and I think that's a big miss for a lot of experienced players and a lot of new players. I think their assumption is, okay, I'm playing DraftKings now. I play this big contest and I play this big contest. And their discipline, if you will, is, okay, well, I'll just max out my contest. So I'll just play the single entry that has, 20,000 people in it or 10,000 entries. And they think they're being disciplined. And by the way, I'm guilty of the same thing. I'm not, it takes a while for you. It's one thing to tell somebody, hey, this is how you should do it. It's another thing for those people to internalize that advice and actually follow through on that advice. So those smaller fields, I really do feel like, even if there are some, TJ Hernandez's in those contests, I do think there is sort of not an edge, but your probability, percentage paid, it makes so much more sense to narrow the field, if you will.
Yeah, and I think that one thing that people really don't even take the time to think about it. You know, if you're a football fan, you've played fantasy forever, and you just want some more action, you're gonna jump into DraftKings or FanDuel. And I don't blame you if you go into the lobby. The games that are highlighted are those biggest contests, right? It's $1 million prize pool, $100,000 prize pool for anywhere between $10 or $50. $1 and $50. You're gonna go after those. And I think the difference between just throwing, if you're playing $5 or $10 a week and that's your entertainment, like by all means, you know, throw it at those contests. But if you're playing hundreds or even thousands of dollars a week and you want to be competitive, I don't think people even take the time to set up goals for themselves or like what they want to do. So if you don't even take the time to do that, how do you know what game you want to play? So that's kind of, I think, where people should start but never do. It's like, what am I trying to get out of this?
Yeah, and for the person that's listening that's only got moderate experience with, let's say, DraftKings, for example, how would you suggest, because it's easy for you to say that and for people to be like, yeah, that sounds good. But when it comes to football season, people are going to forget those words. So if they're listening now, what would you advise them? Like, is there a practical way for them to manage their bankroll where maybe they're keeping some sort of rudimentary chart or some, like, is there some sort of advice where they can sit and be like, all right, that's what I'm going to do to start the season next year?
Yeah, the advice is it's going to be a little bit different if you've dabbled a little bit versus if you've never played before. If you've dabbled a little bit, whatever game you find the most entertaining or that you think you're the best at, like, stick with that game, get really, really good at that game, and then figure out a way to, it's easy to say, like, minimize your downside and maximize your upside. That doesn't always mean you know, playing the smallest tournaments or not going after these big money tournaments, but understanding that these contests aren't apples to apples. You know, the difference between two contests that look exactly the same, one might be paying out 27% of the field, one might be paying out 20% of the field with and then the money's going to be broken up between first place, 10th place, and the last cash. How those payment structures are laid out is really going to impact what games you should be playing. If you're a brand new player, get in there a little bit, like play $1 here, $1 there in these different types of contests and figure out which ones make the most sense to you, which one kind of fits your way of thinking, and then figure out how you want to allocate your money. But I think you could definitely allocate the money in a smart way that is going to maximize your fun and maximize your expected value, hopefully.
Right. I mean, I think realistic expectations are what you kind of have to stick with from the outset when it comes to DFS. I totally agree with all of that. Let me ask you about your process. So, you know, the NFL pricing comes out obviously super early in the week. Do you have a sort of a standard process you go through every single week just to call down your player pool and things of that nature?
Yeah, I think with doing content while also being a relatively high volume player, the lines get pretty blurred because I am looking at so much more than the average DFS player. But from a DFS perspective, I think the most important thing that I'm looking at are the two biggest numbers are going to be the player projections and the ownership projections. The ownership projections is really how I'm going to narrow down my player pool. And again, depending on the types of games that I'm playing, if I'm being a cash game player, if I'm playing on one site, I'm trying to narrow down my player pool to 9 players. I'm trying to figure out a single value lineup that fits for cash games. Whereas in tournaments, it's going to depend on, again, it's what kind of player you are. If you're playing games like I'm playing, my player pool might only be 15 to 20 players because I might only be playing 1 to 5 lineups that week. Whereas a mass multi-entry player, their player pool might be 80 players. So the data that I'm looking at is, I think, the data that a lot of people are looking at. I'm looking at volume numbers for the running backs and the receiver types. I'm looking at Vegas numbers for the big picture. Over-unders, obviously, implied point totals for my quarterbacks, and that's going to have a trickle-down impact on who I'm using. But even if I'm a mass multi-entry player, I'm probably only using 4 or 5 offenses in a given week. So that could give you a pretty good idea of how small your player pool could get, even if you are playing 150 lineups.
Yeah, and I think your approach mirrors Mike McClure's as well, because we go over what we do. We have a Tuesday and a Thursday show, and on Tuesday we go over basically at the front half of the show the lineups that we had, and,
Yeah.
and Mike's always got basically 5 lineups that he submits. I usually have a few more,
Hmm.
frankly, but I do believe, and I do a lot of DFS golf as well. I
Yeah.
do believe in a narrow sort of player pool,
Hmm.
because I think some people get into the issue. They don't want to miss out. They don't want to
Yep.
miss out on this player and this player, and all of a sudden their player pool might be a third bigger than it should be, or maybe
Yeah.
twice as much as it should be. And I think that's advice that people need to internalize. If you're right about your approach, you're going to hit big, and that's obviously what the goal is here. But TJ, you mentioned some of the stuff that people look at. So we have like implied totals, for
Hmm.
example. Totals, those come out in the beginning of the week. Everybody can kind of see, okay, this has a 53-point total, this one's a 55, and everything else is 47 or 48 and a half, whatever it is. And then you're looking at volume, of course. You want to know, how many touches your running back or wide receiver or tight end are getting, in that kind of thing. But going that next level, I'm curious. Let me ask you a general question before I ask you which stats you actually really truly focus on.
Sure.
The general question is, have we come to a point, and I'm asking somebody who's director of football for 4for4, so maybe this isn't a question for you, because but you'll see where I'm going with this. Are we immersing ourselves in too much data and galaxy braining ourselves out of some maybe obvious plays or obvious pivots, because we're just going way too deep on our approach?
I think if we're talking about data from a research point of view, if you are someone that is trying to do your own research and trying to figure out what stats you should be looking at, I think there is a lot of double counting going on. 99% of the time, if whether it's 4for4 or somewhere else, if you have a good projection system, a fantasy point projection system, most of the time that's going to be your best data point for projecting what's going to happen. Those fantasy projections are going to encompass whether it's the implied point total, whether it's a touchdown rate, whether it's a volume for a running back. Those projections for the most part, should and do encompass all of those numbers. Now, how you're fitting that in with the second most important number in DFS, ownership percentage, I think that's where people kind of muddy it up a little bit, because when you, like, the classic example is when you have two guys that do have very close fantasy point projections on offenses with very similar point projections. When we could find the discrepancies in ownership, I think that's where we can find these really big edges that still do exist in NFL. They're harder to spot because there's so much variance, and even on the good decision weeks, you could have some pretty bad results. But I think where people miss the mark is just using that data properly. And again, like the double counting of things, like whether it be a red zone stat, a touch, whatever it might be. And then with things like implied point totals, I don't think people are necessarily, I think implied point total is a really good one to talk about. I just think people use them in a very linear sense, where I think you should be kind of using them in tiers. Like if you have 3 teams projected for 27 to 28 points, and one of those teams is going to be the most popular one, just because that team is projected for one less implied point, that doesn't mean their team should elicit 60% less cumulative ownership. So I think that's where the opportunities really lie.
Right. And I always look at target share as well, or in terms of like how narrow are the targets. For example, in like the Vikings offense, you got Jefferson, you got Thielen, maybe you can include Dalvin Cook in there catching passes, but there are some offenses where it's really spread out really thin. So that obviously the targets are going to be more concentrated on one team, even if it has potentially a lower point total than another team.
Yeah, no, and those are the types of numbers that I think are fun to look at, that do just go beyond simple volume numbers. Touch share and target share numbers are really good ones to use to exploit your opponent, because it's going to give us an opportunity to target some players that the public might be low on. I think maybe a classic example is somebody like a Marquise Brown in a low passing volume offense where Lamar runs so much. When Marquise, he has a 28% target share all year, but that's only equating to say 6 or 7 targets per game. If they're in a situation where all of a sudden maybe they're big underdogs for some reason, and Lamar's going to have to throw it 45 times. Those are the spots where numbers like target share, I think, and when you are digging into deeper data, those are the ones that I do think you can exploit. Touchdown rate numbers are another one. People really don't understand how much that could regress even within just a single season, and people will look at the high touchdown rate guys will often be the ones that the public's targeting because they're scoring a lot, right? But these, if you have a Travis Kelce in a Chiefs offense and his touchdown rate is low for whatever reason, that number is going to bounce back pretty quick. If it's a Amon-Ra St. Brown with Jared Goff throwing him the ball, maybe it's going to stay low all year.
Right. No, that totally makes sense. And we are going to take a quick break, but I do want to ask you on the other end of it, TJ, about those who actually hand build and that aren't using optimizers. Maybe some of the stats that stick out to you that maybe they should be paying attention to for those hand builders. But we'll be back right after this break. And we are back. I am with TJ Hernandez. TJ, I did want to ask you about, the hand builders. I do a lot of hand building as well. And I'm curious, what are, again, for maybe the slightly newer fantasy player or even somebody who has a decent amount of experience, if you were to narrow down some of the stats that are really compelling to you that you always want to either check first or check last, maybe certainly a box to check week to week. And I'll just throw some out there just because I know you're not necessarily looking at anything in front of you. Snap share, route share, red zone snap share, red zone targets, matchups, wide receiver, cornerback, or defensive line, offensive line, things of that nature. The first part is, which of those stats or other stats are you really focused on? The second question is, where are you going to find that data? What tools are you using?
Yeah, I think a couple ones that I'm if we're just talking about non-ownership, non-DFS stats, just like actual football stats that I'm looking at. One of the biggest ones, and we already talked about this, just simple implied point totals. Whoever's sitting atop that weekly implied point total every week, or the top two teams, they're just going to get so much more hype than a team that's projected for whatever it is, 47.5 for a game that's projected for 47.5 points instead of a game that's projected for 50 points. Like, that second tier of offenses for the week in terms of that implied point total or over under, they're always going to be really exciting teams or games to target for me. And then I think just things like regression in scoring rates. Looking for players or quarterbacks that are on good offenses or running backs or wide receivers that are getting significant volume but just haven't turned those volume into touches. I'm always really highlighting those players in my player pool just because we do know that those numbers generally regress to a mean, whether it's a team mean, a player mean, or the league mean. And especially if that's a player that, even if it's just a decent offense, not a bad offense, those guys are going to bounce back. If somebody has 50, 60 targets on the year and they haven't scored yet, the public's going to be down on those guys. But I'm always looking, like, those touchdown regression numbers are some of my favorite numbers to look at week to week.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to also ask you about ownership, because you talked about ownership quite a bit, and it's obviously really important in DFS in general.
Yeah.
But in football or in the NFL, how much are there situations where, let's say it's maybe not the smaller contest, maybe, in other words, not the 100 entry contest, but maybe the contests that are a little bit bigger.
Yeah.
Are you just fading all of the chalk there? Well, obviously that's a big macro question. It's situational week to week, but is that really truly the main priority, or are there some plays that are chalky that you just can't get away from?
I think where people maybe get tripped up on ownership a little bit is just thinking either way too contrarian or just not having the ability, the fortitude to get away from these plays that feel really good, but that's why they end up being the most popular plays, especially if you do come from somebody that plays redraft. Like, it's always play your best plays, right? You don't want to play a guy that's projecting for low numbers. I think what people don't realize is, even in these biggest contests, if we look at something like the DraftKings Millionaire, going back as far as the Millionaire has existed, I mean, salaries have changed a little bit, whatnot, but over the past 2 or 3 years even, we see these winning lineups fit into a pretty tight range of cumulative ownership. That's a number that we should really be paying attention to, and that range has been about like 90 to 120% cumulative ownership. So if you look at if you look at whether it's 4for4 or somewhere else, the projected ownership of each player on your team, if you add those numbers up, if you're within that range, you're probably on the right track. If you're lower than that, if you have all 9 of your players are projected for sub 10% ownership, that's not going to fly. If all 9 of your guys are projected for over 20% ownership, that's not going to fly either. But we see often just 2 or 3 guys that are sub 10% can win a tournament that's as big as the millionaire. And then kind of taking that a step further, if you are looking at that cumulative ownership, not just adding it up, but how are you getting there? The difference between one player that's 40% and one player that's 5% is going to be way different than 2 guys that are projected for 25% ownership. Like, give me the guy that's going to be in 40% of lineups with the 5% guy instead of 2 guys that are going to be in 20% of lineups. And if I am going to eat the chalk on those players, what position am I doing it at? That's another problem I think people really mess up. Like, Alexander Madison, it seems like every year is the classic example. If and when Dalvin gets hurt, I'm taking Alexander Madison at 40% all day. Whereas if for some reason a Justin Jefferson gets hurt, if everybody's playing Adam Thielen, like, I'm just not playing a guy that's going to get 8 targets and he's going to be 40%. That's just a way different beast. So I think understanding when to eat that chalk and when not to is a big thing to understand. And often it is as easy as just what position is it at.
Right. And I definitely think that the positional argument is really solid because, and I think Frank brought this up. He did a show with Derek a couple weeks back, and I think unique roster construction is important.
Yeah.
I know that there was last year there was just a lot of heavy hitters that people were jamming into their lineup, and because of that, because the people were gravitating to the Cooper Kupps of the world, there were instances, for example, where Jonathan Taylor was really just super low owned, and Frank brought up a situation where that was the game where JT scored like 5 touchdowns, and it's one of those things where he had some ownership, but the ownership was sort of gravitating away from him because of his price and because of what guys like Cooper Kupp and some of those high-end talent, some of the high-end talent was doing. And I think kind of knowing that and be able to pivot on and be uncomfortable with the high-priced running back at times is going to be the play over some of the high-priced receivers that everybody is playing.
Yeah, one of the things that I do every week during the season is review the lineups from the winning lineups from the biggest tournaments, the Sunday Million and the Millionaire, and these lessons are going to pretty much you're going to be able to use them whatever tournament you're playing. And one thing that I noticed specifically last year on DraftKings a lot because of how tight DraftKings pricing has got is that we've seen lower ownership ceilings than we've ever seen before. Like in previous years, every week you'd have a couple of guys that are 30, 40, even 50%. Last season, and I think this is going to carry on, assuming DraftKings keeps their salary algorithm, we rarely saw players get over 30%. So the advantage of saying pivoting to a Darrell Henderson from a Cooper Kupp when Kupp's only 25% isn't as great as when you're pivoting to a Darrell Henderson at 5% when Cooper Kupp's 40%. So to your point, I something that I really started harping on last season was using ownership and using these leverage opportunities, not just off of a teammate off of a popular player, but looking for as much leverage as possible in one shot. And what I mean by that is sticking with let's say Darrell Henderson, Cooper Kupp. If you can not just pivot off of a popular player, but also that player that you're pivoting to, say maybe he's a price pivot off of a player on another team in a very similar range, or if he's going to get you to a salary range that nobody's using in that position, you're kind of flipping everything on its head, right? If nobody's paying down at running back and you could pivot off an expensive receiver, all of a sudden not only are you not playing that expensive receiver, but you're also going down to a cheap running back in a week where nobody's using cheap running back. And the examples can be infinite, but just kind of thinking in those terms where you could kind of, kill 2 birds with one stone, so to speak, I think are opportunities we should really be looking for.
Totally makes sense. Okay, so let me narrow it down for the listener. If you could tell the listener or like just say the average DFS player.
Yeah.
And I don't mean average in like they're just average. I just mean like just the everyday DFS player that's playing NFL DFS to follow. And this is kind of a, I didn't prep you with this question, so you might not have a set answer to it, but to follow 2 or 3 rules week to week to ensure they have at least a better chance of success. And I say that in the context of that article that you write, after each week goes and you just kind of like analyze what it sounds like you analyze what people did right and what people did wrong. What are you finding that people are doing wrong if you tell us that, I assume that there's the flip side is what they should be doing right, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, in NFL, like there isn't a magic formula, right? If you're paying attention to whatever subscription site or whatever content creators, a lot of these leverage scenarios are well understood, and you're going to be able to get that information anywhere. So I think from a lineup building perspective, understanding and maximizing those leverage opportunities, like I mentioned, is very important. I would say if you're trying to be the best DFS player possible from a week-to-week basis, I would say that the most important things you could do are kind of outside the actual lineup building. I think the most important things you could do are zero in on a game that you really like and get very, very good at that game. Maybe even a niche game, whether it be showdown, short slates. A lot of people only play the main slate. These smaller 4-game slates, afternoon slate, get really, really good at that. After that, game select. What tournaments have the best structures? What games have the best structures? If you're playing double ups instead of 50-50s, you might be leaving money on the table because it's paying out a smaller percentage of the field. Review. If you are playing in contests and you're trying to get better, nobody is reviewing. Like every single contest you play on DraftKings, you could export the CSV and see every single lineup. If you want to look at my lineup, Osmo lineups, Mike's lineup, your lineup, you can see all of our lineups at once, calculate our exposures, match it up, see are you doing the same thing? And in the Millionaire, there's hundreds of thousands of entries every week. I would be surprised if 100 of those guys are exporting those lineups every week and doing that. So I would say get really good at one game select, review, and then the last thing that no one is doing is late swap. Like nobody's using late swap in NFL. That's the single biggest edge in NFL is probably late swap.
Yeah, and we did a lot of that. At Fantasy Football Today DFS, we really there were situations where we should have late swapped or should have approached it differently, and we just analyzed, how we did the late swap because there's so many situations where you're going into the 4:00 slate and you're pretty much dead, and people just don't want to pay attention to that. They feel like if the 1:00 games are going really poorly, then I guess I'm done. But it is actually pretty easy to sneak in there. There was another thing was making a carbon copy of the same lineup, something that Mike McClure does in some of the contests. So he'll have 2 of the same lineup in the same contest, and then you can always tweak one of those 2 depending on how it's all unfolding. So, and I want to say this too, TJ, the niche games advice, that the afternoon slate, I can tell you just from my own experience, while I think I'm pretty good at the main slate, my best success in the last 2 years has been that 4:00, 3 or 4 game slate. Yeah. I absolutely love it.
Yeah, I mean, we could do hours on both of those topics alone, the late swap and the smaller slate contest. But I think the thing people don't understand about late swap, especially even if you're not playing crazy high volume, if you're playing a couple $100 a week or even $100 a week, even if late swap doesn't get you in the black on the week, like money not lost is money won, right? So if you could salvage your week from losing, having a negative 90% ROI to a negative 40% ROI just on one late swap, that's money won. That at the end of the year, that's going to be that much more money in your bottom line. And then I think even if you don't want to play a bunch of other slates, if you just think about it as a perspective of it's an optimal hedge. A lot of people will play the main slate, say they're playing cash games and they want to hedge their lineup, so they play 2 lineups instead of 1. If you're playing multiple slates, it's just kind of a natural hedge. You might have some overlap, but you're getting exposure to players that you might not otherwise on the full slate. So you're still playing your whatever you think your optimal lineup is without doing it just for the sake of hedging. And smaller fields, easier to win. A lot of times, sometimes you just find worse players in there because the big dogs are focusing on these big tournaments.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll ask you a couple more questions before I let you go, TJ. And for the record, we're going to have, as you've seen, we've every couple of weeks we have one of these off-season podcast series with somebody like TJ Hernandez. So stay tuned. We'll have another one in a couple of weeks here. Let me ask you kind of a fun question, or maybe it's not fun. We'll see. And maybe you don't have any memory of this. I can tell you. I wanted to ask you about a bad beat or a lucky break story. My latest, I shouldn't say latest, the luckiest break. It wasn't even a break, but the thing that really sticks out to me that really like won me like an extra several $1,000s was the game where Kyler Murray threw a Hail Mary to DeAndre Hopkins with 4 Bills covering. Oh, and the Bills are your team, right, TJ?
Yeah, they're my adopted team, or I'm adopted by them, I guess.
So a great fan base to be adopted by. And I think the Bills are winning the Super Bowl this year. But with all that said, that play, like, I was like probably 10th in a contest. I vaulted up to 2nd in a pretty big single entry contest. I'm just curious. I always like the bad beat or the just lucky break, Hail Mary stories. Anything like that happened to you in the last like year or two where you're like, man, I wish that didn't happen, or I wish it did happen?
I always tell myself I'm going to remember the good luck, so I don't harp on the bad beats so much, and then, of course, they never stick. I mean, I haven't had any crazy brutal beats in the last couple years. Maybe it's just because I've been doing this so long that I'm numb to it at this point.
Yeah.
The one that's kind of seared into my memory is the Calvin Johnson was playing against the Seahawks, and he literally fumbled out of the end zone, like going into the end zone. That fumble cost me a live qualifier seat. So that one's always going to hurt. That one will never go away. Yeah.
I'll tell you, because we've been kind of referencing poker terms, particularly with bad beat, and I know you're obviously a poker guy. I won't get into the story, but I played in the World Series of Poker in 2018, and I don't even know if I would call it a bad beat, but it was full boat over full boat. And if I win this hand on day 2, I'm probably in the top 4 or 5% of the field. It was such a breathtaking beat for another day, TJ. But that's when it comes to bad beats. For some reason, I got to relay that to you since you're a poker player.
No, I get it. And our poker background probably helps us with the numb feeling we get when we get bad beat in DFS.
Yeah, speak for yourself, because it's brand new and fresh every single time for me. Let me ask you a couple more questions. So here's the thing. We got the NFL draft. It's coming up in a couple days. And then we've got just kind of this off-season part where it's just nothing's really going to happen. Training camps are eventually going to open after rookies report and all of that stuff. But when the season starts, I'm just curious, in the first few weeks where we really don't have any data, at least fresh data, do you have a particular different approach to the first few games of the season, since we don't really have much of a sample size outside of the year before? Is there something maybe different in terms of your approach there?
I think that we're kind of all going into early season blind. There are a lot of really exciting opportunities in DFS, I think, early in the season, especially the first couple of weeks. Rookies and players on new teams, I think, are just always going to be wildly undervalued early in the NFL season, and you're often going to see that in things like ownership percentage. I think week 1, week 2, maybe even week 3, I think you could almost, outside of teams that are going to have high implied point totals, but you can almost blindly fade a lot of ownership early in the season, just because people are making decisions based on last year's data so often early in the year that there's a lot of opportunity there. So I'm really looking at that. And then one thing that I have noticed is, just like us, Vegas takes a couple weeks to get their stuff dialed in. So I would say maybe the first 2, maybe 3 weeks is when I will kind of go off the rails in terms of offenses I'm targeting for my for the teams that I'm just building around. Usually it's, obviously we know the teams with the highest implied point total. I like to go into that second tier pretty much all season, but early in the year I'll dip down to that third tier, even teams that are projected for the 23, 24 points that nobody's playing. There could be a lot of fruit on those limbs early in the season.
Yeah, I find people think of trends sometimes when they're not actually trends. Like the first couple weeks, a team really flashes on defense, for example, and you're like, oh man, they've just got a really good run defense. Meanwhile, they played two terrible teams, and people aren't going to pay up for the hot running back in week 3 because of what they did in 2 weeks. And the reality is, it's the perfect spot to play that running back. I think your sample size, and we talk about this on the FFT DFS show in terms of sample sizes that are actually true to being trends, and ones that just aren't really an adequate sample size yet. And I think early in the season, you can really take advantage of that.
Yeah, I think people really, really butcher matchup data early in the year. It takes a while to get that going, and I just think any data that's that small of a sample in general, I think people really overweight. Even data that we think is very reliable, like volume. Like, you're going to get your random guys that are getting 10 targets per game in the first 2 weeks for whatever reason, and taking the chance and fading guys like that can be fun too. Like I mentioned, we've kind of got pretty heavy into the Formula One game. We've actually partnered up with Run the Sims, and we've been putting out a ton of really good content projections there. Our Run the Sims partner Justin Freeman actually shot first place in the main GPP in the F1 contest yesterday, so we've really been going hard on that. And then football wise, even if you are a DFS player, kind of the nice bridge in the offseason between Super Bowl and preseason is best ball. So we've been really firing up our best ball offerings this year, specifically Underdog. We have a bunch of really great tools that Sam Hoppin over at 4for4 has put together, and we have some series that are coming out that explain how to be really good at these underdog, these big best ball tournaments. Kind of everything that you and I have been talking about translated to best ball. So I would definitely check that out, because I mean, best ball is, if you want to tie up your money for 10 months, there's no better way than best ball.
I think that's my problem with best ball, more than anything else.
Yeah,
but
for sure.
I guess if you're tying your money up for a long period of time, you may as well do it in the NFL.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
that would be the counter to that. TJ, thank you for coming on. We're going to wrap it up there. For TJ, I am Sia Nejad. This is Fantasy Football Today DFS, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.